But, surprisingly, the military dictatorship does a pretty bad job of running the country. And so they have all these economic problems, they get weak and they piss off the rich planter class. And everything starts moving back to democracy again with this thing called the Amnesty Act, and then a slow sort of march towards election. And the first guy to get elected is this dude, Jose Sarni, who inherits this slew of problems from the dictatorship and can't solve them all right away. So he gets super unpopular. Then another dude gets elected in '89, Fernando Collor, and he gets impeached in '92, so that's 3 years. And his vice president comes to power, which leaves this guy Fernando Henrique Cardoso as Minister of Finance. And he puts in place this thing called the Plano Real, which after decades of economic shit, finally gets some stability in the Brazilian economy. This is 1994 we're talking about. I was alive. It was 22 years ago. As for what the Plano Real was, it's basically just a bunch of like central bank management, fiscal controls and monetary controls that give them like a stable currency to work with. The details aren't particularly. So anyways, that guy gets reelected. And then in 2002, this man named Lula de Silva, or Luis Inácio Lula de Silva, is elected in 2002 and then re-elected in 2006. It's a transition of power from one side to the other for really the first time that's happened peacefully in Brazilian history. Again, to give you guys a little context, for us that happened after our second election, right? So it took Brazil a little bit longer to get to that sort of stable, peaceful, democratically minded place. But they got there, finally, about 20 years ago. Sort of. Because in June 2013, which they're linking to the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street here, but this over a long period of time. I don't know that that's quite a fair connection to make. But anyways, for days, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in several cities to protest. And just to give you a sense of what that looked like, here's some pictures. I mean, it's some pretty big deal protest. And initially, it was movements against the increase in public transport fares. But it got huge after the use of excessive force by state police. And then people were angry about all kinds of issues. It got kicked off, the new stadium projects for the World Cup and a bunch of other stuff. Gets a whole bunch of people pissed off and angry in the street. But it has this problem of, because it's so, all kinds of different issues, it doesn't really congeal, it doesn't really focus its, power on one specific thing, and kind of nothing happened. But that begs the question, what happened between 1994 when we get this stability and 2013 when everything falls apart and everyone is pissed? Now, the simplest answer to that question is in this graph right here. Now, this is the GDP of Brazil in blue, Mexico in red, and Peru in orange for comparison. But you see, things are going pretty good in a nice upward trend, from about the 80s to the 90s, and there's a little dip at the end of the century, but not really that major. I mean, it's basically just a lost decade of the 90s. And then in the 2000s, they have this crazy boom. This is per capita GDP. It goes from 2,800 in 2002 to 13,000 in 2011. It goes up 6 times. And again, the simple explanation for that is this commodities prices graph right here, which is basically the same shape, although it's a little bit ahead, which shows this massive boom in commodities prices over the 2000s. And so like we talked about way back when, Brazil is this super resource-rich country that becomes majorly run by plantations and by resource exports, and is run by these really greedy guys who just came there to just get rich. And so through the aughts, everything is wonderful. They're rolling in money, oil and iron and gold, they're all worth a lot. And then, to simplify world economics, gravity finally catches up with China, commodities prices crash, there's the European financial crisis also at the same time. And basically, the forces that were buoying the Brazilian economy drop out from under it. It falls into a terrible recession, and everyone gets pissed. But let's zoom in a little bit now on these boom years and see exactly what was going on in the country over that time. Because like we talked about, Brazil has always been this desperately unequal place. In Gini coefficient, Brazil is 19th to last, a Gini of about 52. Again, to put that in perspective, the US is about 96 with a Gini of about 41. So we're pretty bad, and they're much worse. But during those boom years, and under the role of Lula de Silva, who was the founder of the Workers' Party and was a really good guy for the people, some good things started happening. And I want to talk about those first. There's a lot of big social programs that get put into place. One of them is PRONAF, which is a subsidy program geared towards family agriculture that guaranteed financing for equipment and cultivation and encouraged the use of new technology. Over 800,000 rural inhabitants were assisted by the credit and by the research and extension programs involved, and a special line of credit was available for women and young farmers. Then there was also the land reform program, which wanted to provide suitable living and working conditions for over 1 million families in certain areas allotted by the state, and it would generate 2 million jobs. They were also working on a guarantee of an infrastructure for those settlements, which would have schools and health outlets, and basically to create not just a safety net, but like a livable life for these people at the bottom of this traditionally horribly unequal and unfair and oppressive and slave-based economy. So basically, for all of Brazilian history, the rich ruling class has treated the vast resources of Brazil as their little personal piggy bank. But during the biggest boom years of all of them, there's actually this super populist dude in charge who allows the common folk to have a little bit of access to that personal piggy bank. And everyone's making so much money, they don't really care. They let it go. They're like, yeah, sure, get some money to the poor folk. So on the Corruption's Perception Index of all the countries in the world, Brazil is ranked 154th out of 167. But good news, they're beating Somalia, Afghanistan, Venezuela, not quite Syria or Zimbabwe. So corruption has been a huge problem in Brazil for a long, long time. And everyone kind of just let it happen. But the thing is, in order to get everyone to let it happen, Brazil actually put in place a really strong legal framework aimed at curbing corruption that was like the model for a lot of other countries that developed later. The thing is, there was just no actual enforcement. No one used all that stuff. They actually even have a thing called the Clean Company Act, which was just passed like a year ago, that says companies are responsible for the corrupt practices of their employees and can be held liable without a finding of fault. And that's another thing that's going to come into play when we start talking about what's happening today. Because the idea here is that you, as the leader of an organization, are responsible for the corruption within that agency, even if no one can prove you had anything to do with it. And so the final thing is this branch of government called the Public Prosecutor's Office, which is totally independent from the other 3 branches of government, and has been called by this one dude, who actually is going to play a role in the story later, the 4th branch of government. And these guys, their only job is to uphold justice. So they bring charges in criminal cases, but they're also supposed to request acquittal of charges if, in a trial, they become convinced the defendant is innocent. And they get the last word on whether charges are filed, except in some very rare cases. And so the prosecutors in these offices, they're appointed by the court themselves. Now, it seems like those courts are appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate, but they're also supposed to be non-political. So I'm honestly not entirely sure how that works. But the point is, these guys are supposed to be very independent of politics, and from what we're about to hear, it seems like they are. So here's basically what I want you to take away from this about the history of Brazil. Number one, started by Portuguese colonists who were very interested in extracting resources and ran very much a slave-based economy and split up the local ethnic groups and turned them against each other in order to maintain their power. And then in the peak of that monarchic period, the crown actually moves itself to Brazil to establish a very powerful core, oligarchic core to Brazilian power. And then after the Brazilians finally kick out the European crown, they have this incredibly unstable period of like democracy, fascism, democracy, dictatorship, democracy, fascism, that all seems to have the strings being pulled by this elite oligarchy still that runs the plantations and owns kind of everything and has all the money and uses all of those resources that Brazil has. I mean, this is the Amazon rainforest we're talking about. This is one of the most resource-rich areas on the planet. This oligarchic class just treats that as their own little savings reservoir and basically just play politics with all the different people involved to maintain the hegemony that has always existed and has always allowed them to become extremely rich through a lot of corruption. But then after the last period of dictatorship, some pretty serious democratic reforms got put in place, including these independent judiciaries. And during the biggest boom years in Brazil's history, a super populist guy who was not from the oligarchy, who grew up poor, comes into power and starts actually socializing the economy and giving a lot back to the lower classes. And everyone was fine with that while there was all kinds of money to go around. But now we're in a tough spot. Brazil is in a super tough spot. And so people are starting to get a little bit pissed at all those socialist reforms. So they hate that guy, and they hate his regime, and they've been trying to bring it down. But Brazil actually has mandatory voting in its elections, so a populist is an extremely powerful person. And despite their best efforts, they haven't been able to displace him or his successor, both of whom we're going to talk about in the next video. Until now, possibly. And what it took was literally the biggest corruption scandal ever in human history. So tomorrow we're going to get into that. I hope you enjoyed all this context in history. Personally, I found it fascinating, but I don't know, maybe you didn't, in which case, why the fuck are you still watching? Go out and get a goddamn life. Don't sit here with a video you're bored by. Go do other things. There's like, you know, all kinds of video games and movies and TV shows, so go do some of that shit instead of listening to me rant about Brazilian history. You know what? I don't even want to fucking say goodbye to you. Fuck off. Sorry, that got out of hand. I don't know what came over me. Thanks for watching. I will talk to you again tomorrow. Toodaloo, arrivederci, adios.